It's Halloween, but we promise there'll be no tricks on this week's podcast. Today we'll take a trip back to the White House where Jacqueline Kennedy found a clever way to take her daughter Caroline and one of her cousins out trick-or-treating in the nation's capital.
And I'll also speak with the JFK Library's new curator who started the job earlier this year, and she'll give us a sneak peek of the newest exhibit being planned for next spring, which should be quite a treat. All this on this week's episode of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Welcome to this week's episode of JFK 35, a podcast by the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. I'm Jamie Richardson.
And I'm Matt Porter. Halloween can provide a lot of fun for any family, and the Kennedy family was no exception. But the question for the first family was how to enjoy the night without the burden of being the most notable family in the United States.
Yes, and on All Hallows Eve in 1962, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy came up with a clever idea to take her daughter Caroline trick-or-treating while staying under the radar and not getting recognized. Along with her sister-in-law, Jean Kennedy Smith, she put on what essentially looks like a garment bag with eye holes cut out, so they kind of look like they're ghosts, maybe. But Caroline and her cousin Stephen dressed up too. Stephen wore a skull mask and looked like a skeleton, and then Caroline wore a pretty spooky witch's mask. We had Jean Kennedy Smith here a few years ago for a Kennedy Library forum, and I'll let her pick up the story.
She called one night and said she wanted to go trick-or-treating in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And she had a whole outfit, she said, from herself and for me, because it was a sort of sheet with a head. Yes. And so we went around, all around Georgetown, and I supposed to have to speak.
There we are. There's it.
I had to speak because she has a very well-known, a very good voice. I mean,
She did? Jackie had a distinctive voice?
Very distinct. And so we had to watch that. She couldn't.
So you
she
must have
wasn't
been
allowed.
the one that had to
So
say
I had
trick or
to
treat.
Trick or treat. And nobody got her.
Well, what an amazing little story that I think most people probably haven't heard. You know, I was there when Jean Kennedy Smith was here for that forum, and it was pretty interesting to hear them talk about, deciding to go down to Georgetown, and sort of Mrs. Kennedy was sort of the ringleader of it all, saying, I want to go trick-or-treating, from what Jean Kennedy Smith said. It was just really interesting to see. I think we all think about Halloween and taking our kids out trick-or-treating and sort of the annual tradition as your kids are growing up. And it was really nice, for me anyway, to see how, that bit of normalcy continued with the Kennedy family while in the White House. And one thing I realized looking at the date, that was Halloween 1962. And just a few days before that, President Kennedy had sort of settled the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you think about it being a very tense time, but yet Mrs. Kennedy still able to, find a way to get her daughter Caroline and have a little fun on what is an annual tradition for most normal kids.
Right, and I had seen that photograph so many times before and always wondered, what is happening here? Why are they wearing this? It's such an odd look. And for people who are interested, we'll definitely have photos or links to this photo online. And there's also, in addition to just that 1962 Halloween, we have a few other photographs from other Halloween celebrations. There's a really famous one of John Jr. and Caroline in the Oval Office surprising their dad, which also rings to this very they're just like a normal family, even though they're in the White House. And
one of my favorite Halloween photos actually isn't from the John F. Kennedy family, but Senator Ted Kennedy, when he was a young boy, we have this adorable black and white photo of him in a pirate costume. And every time I see that, I just smile. It's a really nice thing to see. And, a lot of people come here to research our collection on the documents and the art and sort of the letters and things that were going on in the Kennedy administration. But it really is a treasure trove of also personal photographs that we have here in the building.
Yeah, you can definitely do a lot of investigating, just looking at the photographs to see what's going on. And speaking of that adorable photo of little Ted Kennedy, we'll have a number of links to these photos from that night, from the 1962 Halloween, 1963, and the young Ted Kennedy one on our website in the show notes, so you can check those out.
And speaking of life as a child in the Kennedy family, the Kennedy White House, you got to speak with the JFK Library's new curator about a new exhibit featuring life in the first family.
Right. So I sat down with Janice, our new curator, Janice Hodson, who has had a very interesting career path, which you'll hear about. And we chatted about the upcoming exhibit that will bring an in-depth look at the first family and life inside the White House. So we are here with Janice Hodson, who is the Supervisory Museum Curator. Janice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So you're fairly new here, and we want to extend a very warm welcome to you to the JFK Library and to the JFK 35 podcast. And it turns out you also have worked at the JFK birthplace. So this
Yes.
is not your first JFK site.
Not my first JFK experience,
Yeah,
I
so
guess
how-
you could say.
How has that informed your work here or influenced sort of how you approach things?
Well, the JFK birthplace, it's operated by official name, John F. Kennedy National Historic Site. It's operated by the National Park Service and is actually managed jointly with the Longfellow National Historic Site and the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site. So I was curator for both the birthplace and for the Longfellow House. The birthplace really is, It's really Rose's story. It's Rose Kennedy's story about her son. And that was not, I wouldn't say an introduction because it's still all around us, the mythologizing of John F. Kennedy's and his presidency. But it was, a vivid example of the ways in which, the family sought to find ways of keeping him in the public memory. Jacqueline Kennedy's pet project was the library, the creation of the library, and Rose Kennedy took it upon herself to buy back the family, her first home, and the house that Kennedy was born in, and make that her personal contribution to his memory. And so I guess the way it would inform my approach here is, I'm not a political historian. I am more about material culture. And one of the interesting aspects of our collections, which somewhat, ties into in a way, to our new special exhibit that will be opening in April of 2020, is the ways in which Kennedy, the persona, were created.
So why don't we jump ahead actually and talk about, there is an exhibit opening up in April, and can you tell us the name or theme, topic?
It is called First Children, Caroline and John Jr. in the Kennedy White House. And it came out of the germ of the exhibit was an exhibit that was done probably a good 15 years ago at the library before there was a special exhibit space. And it focused on Caroline Kennedy's doll collection, dolls that were presented to her. Primarily, I think featured in that exhibit were dolls presented by heads of state. And it was popular with the public because there is this interest, this personal interest in the family. So we've taken those dolls, expanded them to include gifts that were presented to both children, sometimes in pairs, sometimes individually, not just by heads of state. The personal reaction to the Kennedy children went beyond the political and into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Joe Average, who would see news clippings of these children on television. They would see images, some of which are iconic, like John Jr. playing underneath the desk in the Oval Office while Kennedy's working at it. Sees images like this in magazines, articles in newspapers. There are papers of the stature of the New York Times and the Washington Post would include articles saying, John Jr. gets his first haircut, Caroline goes riding. My favorite one is Daddy just sits there doing nothing, which was from a remark that Caroline made to some reporters at the White House who asked, what's your father doing? And she said, he's just sitting there doing nothing with his shoes and socks off, something like that. And which led Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary, to say that it was a new problem for him because he had to find a way to filter Caroline Kennedy's remarks.
Somebody he couldn't control.
Yeah. And so there was this keen interest in the children, in them as a family. Kennedy, being the savvy politician he was, recognized the positive role that this type of imagery could have and encouraged it. On the other hand, his wife discouraged it. So part of the exhibit focuses on that interplay of the media obsession with the children and Jacqueline Kennedy's attempts to preserve some form of privacy for them. But the public, all this exposure, gave the public a sense that they knew these people on some type of personal level. It was probably the first true celebrity presidency, in part because of the medium of television, which Kennedy was the first president to use effectively. And the public response was to inundate the White House with gifts for these kids, not just on holidays and their birthdays, but year-round. We have images in the collection of van loads of boxes of toys being delivered to the White House, notes from people about their gift, thank you responses occasionally, but they ranged from, you'll have some beautiful, creche, given by the King of Jordan to John Jr. And then you have this little ceramic piggy bank made by a couple of women. We don't know where they were from, but just ordinary people who, made the ceramic piggy bank, got the greenware, glazed it, decorated it with rhinstones that spell out John Jr. And they made one for Caroline as well. And so, this, what we would call kitsch, but these were items that were made or purchased, often made, for the children by members of the public who felt some kind of personal connection or who could identify with them because they had young families themselves. They were, a lot of the heads of these young households in late 50s, 1960, were veterans, as Kennedy was. By 1960, something like 47% of the voting population in this country were people under the age of 49. So it was very important Kennedy find ways that these people could identify with him, that the average American voter could identify with him.
Do you have any sense of how many presents were sent to John and Caroline?
Ooh, I don't. There are lists of what we obtained, lists that were kept by the White House. Not all of the things were actually, they were received by the White House, I should say, list of things that were received. Some were probably given away. There was an indication in one article that sometimes the excess toys were given away to children's hospitals and places like that. But I actually don't have a count of how many things were sent, or typically over a week, how many things they may have received.
So you think about just the mail coming in for the president himself, and
Yeah.
then on top of that, you have gifts for for him, and then for the children. So it's a busy mailroom at the White House.
I mean, they were getting things like live hamsters in the mail. People were mailing pets to them. They finally, the president and Mrs. Kennedy finally, publicly stated, no more pets. Don't send us any more live animals. So we have one little guy in the exhibit. He's a little mohair mouse. And we learned from the accession file for him that he has a name, Tony, and there's a story that goes with him that was written by the person who sent him to the White House. The person who did that was a sophomore in a Catholic high school in a smallish community in Illinois, who was a fan of President Kennedy's. A group of of girls from her school saw him when he was stomping through the area during the 1960 presidential campaign, and she wrote a story about it, a fantasy, as she called it. She had a writing assignment in school, and she decided to make President Kennedy's visit her topic, but the fantasy element was that Tony the Mouse meets the president on the campaign trail and travels throughout his presidential campaign in his pocket, seeing how he interacts with people, listening to his different speeches. And because Mrs. Kennedy was an animal lover, he got to stay. They brought him to the White House after he was elected, and he became Caroline's best friend.
Oh my God, that is so precious. I love that so much.
So that's an example of the kind of stories, many of which we don't know about these pieces, but that's the type of impulse that people were acting on.
Have there been other stories you've uncovered, either in the process of working on this exhibit or just sort of getting acclimated, that have really either moved or surprised or amused you as this one kind of is cute?
Oh, boy.
It's a big question, I guess. But
let's see. Let me think. Tony's fresh in my mind because we're still gathering Tony material. And we just recently found out, corroborated who the person was who gave him. And now we're wondering if she may still be around and we could make contact. I think overall, with the collection itself, it is striking the amount of stuff that we have, which if you were to look at it, you'd say, my God, why do we have that? Because you're dealing with a history collection. You're not dealing with a fine arts collection per se, a high-style decorative arts collection. We certainly have those elements in the collection, but a lot of it focuses on public reaction to the presidency of John F. Kennedy during the time he was in office. The other large component are of the responses to Kennedy, and this kind of ties into the birthplace work, the responses of members of the public immediately after, in the years immediately following the assassination, and people sending things as ways of memorializing him, things that demonstrate the emotional impact of the assassination on them. There is a section in the First Children exhibit that is going to include drawings made by children that were sent to the White House, and some of which were specifically sent to the Kennedy children by other children after the assassination.
Oh, wow. And
in one collection of that type includes a note from the teacher of this particular class. I mean, these weren't just classes or school children in the United States. They were also school children in Europe. And this particular teacher, in sending this collection of drawings to the White House, to Mrs. Kennedy specifically, although many were inscribed to the children or are of the children, wrote of how this was a way for these kids to process this national trauma, and they asked, can we draw anything we want related to the president? And the response was yes. And the number of them who chose Caroline and John Jr. as their subjects, or just groups, showing the whole family, the late president, Mrs. Kennedy, the two kids, sometimes the pet, together. These weren't necessarily sad images, and some of them were responses to the images they had seen in the media. You don't necessarily know that this little crayon figure is meant to be John Jr., but he's saluting, so that's who it's meant to be. And there's a large number of little saluting, slightly more than stick figure boys.
Yeah. Wow.
Among these drawings.
Well, it's interesting to think about when something kind of large and tragic happens. The children are watching, and they're picking up signals from their parents or teachers and television, certainly. And so of course they would have a reaction and feel strongly. And if Caroline and John were their age, then they would feel even more so.
Yeah. And, you're talking about other children and being able to relate or try and process the idea that these are children who have lost a parent.
Right. Okay. So I want to step back a little bit from the sort of this close look at the children and the artifacts we have related to them and the other documents and whatnot, and kind of a little more globally about what do we have? So it sounds like we have, everything. It's from the King of Jordan sending something really beautiful and valuable, and then something that's very homemade and very heartfelt. So what else do we have? We have presents, and then what else is in the collections here?
We have campaign-related materials and memorabilia. We have objects that were mass-produced outside of the campaign that reflect either the public's obsession with President Kennedy, even during his lifetime, or a really keen interest in his programs. Things like space-themed objects, banks, toys that I would actually like to use more of in our permanent exhibits as a way of showing the impact or how these particular programs captured the imagination of the people living through the time. We have some very old pieces that were historic pieces, fine art, like our ancient Egyptian statue that's part of our permanent exhibit, that are among the important state gifts that were presented. We have personal artifacts in the form of clothing, jewelry, accessories of that type, part of the permanent exhibit on Mrs. Kennedy, includes, personal items of that nature, because there is a fascination with that aspect
That's something
of their lives.
When I get asked, a question I come across a lot is like, what do you have of that's there? Is that what do we have of the clothes? Mrs. Kennedy certainly was an iconic dresser, very important. And, the president as well was known for his hatlessness, but also known for being a snappy dresser, and the image we have of him is.
We've got some of his sunglasses. We've got, let's see, I'm still learning the collection, only having been here 6 months, but some of the most weird stuff we have are portraits that were done by people of Kennedy that were either presented to him, during the time he was still president, or again immediately after the assassination. Portrait carved into a peach pit or something like that.
Yes.
So they range from these very rather awkward attempts to portray the president and sometimes his family to these very sophisticated renderings by trained artists. We have things like the models of the different space capsules for the space program, things that were used to educate Kennedy as to, okay, here's our projection for the Apollo model, here's the Gemini model, things he didn't live to actually see come to fruition, but were all part of the larger plan of the space program right from the beginning. Plaques, sculptures, furnishings, a small amount of furnishings from the White House, a handful of some of the objects that he had on his desk in the Oval Office. And another component of the collection, which we don't tend to think of in terms of objects as opposed to the archival, the manuscripts, is Ernest Hemingway stuff.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, we had an episode in the past with our Hillary with the Hemingway specialist. Yeah, it's like this very fun fact that we also have him here.
Yeah, and a lot of people ask why. I had a Harvard student recently ask why. And Hillary probably she must have told that story, but it's basically, Hemingway was one of the writers that Kennedy admired. He was supposed to come to the inauguration, but couldn't. Hemingway, that is. And Jacqueline Kennedy decided it would be a good idea to try and get all his papers to come here to the Kennedy Library. I don't know what year that was, but along with the papers came certain objects, like a lot of World War I related stuff. World War I was a very key event in Hemingway's life. So his dog tags, bullet fragments, some of the big game that were
That's
downed
right.
by,
Yes, I have seen
by him
some of
or his
those.
last wife.
Yep.
So we have the impala, who's affectionately known as Eddie around here, or at least between Hillary and me. And lion skin, leopard skin. There are some objects down in storage which I have to check out because I have to check the catalog number in the record to see, okay, are these tusks related to Hemingway or to
Right.
JFK?
JFK had his
that might have been
scrimshaw.
presented to him. Another cool JFK object we have is his golf cart.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
The golf cart that there are a couple of them, at least a couple of them he had, because you see different ones in film footage of him on the Cape. But this was the last one he was using. It still has its 1963 license plate on it, and so things like that are very fun. And the whole thing about objects, why I'm an object person, is our objects tend to outlive us, and
Yes.
And when you're dealing with historical personages, these things are, there's an immediacy to them. They're like firsthand witnesses. They can't speak, but they're witnesses and survivors from that history, and it's a way to make historical figures more human and relevant.
I think that's perfect. I'm really excited to see what comes next, the exhibit especially, and what, all of the future plans for the library and the exhibit. So thank you so much for coming to speak with me, and we look forward to the exhibit.
You're welcome, Jamie.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, Jamie, that was a great interview. It was nice to hear from Janice, and I am really looking forward to that new exhibit in the spring.
Me too. I think it'll have a really unique view of life in the White House and add some nuance to the story that we've seen and thought about for a long time.
It will be great, I know. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this week's podcast. Stay with us next time as we bring you more stories from the JFK Library. And if you have questions or story ideas, please email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And if you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great week.